So with the question of gender and transgender conversations, this is probably an area that most of us have not given a lot of thought to until recent years. But there's a recent documentary, I don't know if you've seen it, called The Gender Revolution. And the host, Katie Couric, was interviewing two people towards the end that I want to highlight for you. This was Renee Richards and Hari Neff, and interviewing them at the very end of the documentary. And Renee Richards is someone who had transitioned in 1975. She was a professional tennis player and the first transgender woman to compete in the U.S. Open. And so she's 82 at the time of this interview. Hari Neff is 23 and an international model and star of the television show Transparent. And Neff identifies as trans. And their conversation illustrates, even in the last few years, how conversations around gender and sense of gender and sexuality have changed pretty dramatically. So Richards, the tennis player, offers what it's meant to her to rely on the binary between male and female or man and woman. And Richards says, I'm really not beyond the pink and blue stuff. To me, the idea of a binary is what I think the world is. It's the spice of life. It's what makes us keep going. And I think that's appealing, and I like it. But Neff sees gender as something that's fluid and can evolve, and says it's absolutely a binary society that we live in, but I believe that no single person is absolutely gendered. Male and female, they're just wisps of smoke. If something works for you in a moment, then you embrace it. If other parts of you don't, you get rid of it. And this generational divide really captures the substantial shifts in perception of the experience of gender identity, even just in the recent decade. So people of different generations are thinking differently about gender, not only because they're different ages, but because the eras that shaped them have spoken about gender so differently. And that's really going to be important for the church navigating this in terms of opportunities for ministry and making connections in an area that's so divisive. So let me give you some foundational terms here. I want to start by just defining some things. Like I'll say things like biological sex or gender identity. So biological sex usually refers to a person's chromosomal makeup, gonads, genitalia, whereas gender identity is usually a person's experience of themselves as a man or a woman, a boy or a girl, or a different gender identity than that. Whereas gender roles have more to do with what culture says is appropriate for a boy or a girl or a man or a woman, and that can fall into some stereotypes and so on and so forth. Transgender is more of an umbrella term that essentially refers to people adopting a cross-gender identity. If you think of trans as like a transatlantic flight going across the Atlantic, spanning across gender identities to another gender. And sometimes we contrast that with cisgender, which is this side of, so people who don't experience their gender identity in a way that's different than their biological sex, then they would be thought of as cisgender. Gender dysphoria is what I tend to work with. These are people who suffer from a distress associated from a lack of congruence between biological sex and gender identity. And so if you think of euphoria as a positive emotional state, dysphoria is a negative emotional state tied to that lack of congruence. Gender non-binary is more of an umbrella term too for a lot of different ways in which people experience gender identity. They would say that it's outside the binary or in between the binary. It's more of an umbrella term. Usually when I come across umbrella terms, I just ask the person what it means to them to use that term, because people will mean different things with it. That's a nice entryway into a relationship with the person, opportunity maybe for ministry. And gender bending is really when people push back against gender expectations in their society. You don't even have to be transgender to push back against gender norms. And so sometimes teenagers will do that. Sometimes it's how they dress, the way they keep their hair, but they kind of push back against cultural expectations for how they might behave and relate. And then intersex conditions are really just, these are medical conditions where the person has shared reproductive tissue of male and female. And so it's, in some ways, it has very little to do with this conversation at all, except this group of people is at a higher risk of having gender dysphoria. That's the only reason really I include that, but it's a different experience. Okay, you can tell we're going to be in some deep water here for a little bit, so I want us to really understand some foundations so that we can move into a ministry kind of angle of entry into ministry care. But another thing that I want to share with you are, when I was working on my first book on this topic, I was trying to understand how people disagreed with each other, and so I came up with 3 lenses through which people see this topic. 3 lenses. And it affects everything else that I'm going to talk about, because you'll see my quotes and illustrations and things about ministry through different lenses. So let me walk through these really briefly. And there's not a lot of clarity in Scripture around the topic of gender identity in the way that there's clarity around same-sex sexual behavior, as just for instance. I think there's a few passages that speak to something like this. You have a passage like in Deuteronomy 22:5 that talks about not wearing the other sex's clothing. And it apparently has to do with the ancient Israelites and Canaanite practices of a neighboring nation, and not doing the things that they were doing, which was swapping clothing and gender for engaging in same-sex behavior. And so it's a little bit removed from some of the things that I see in my office, and I think there's just less clarity about what to do with something like this. And so for some people, when there's less clarity, it means we shouldn't go anywhere near this. This is to be avoided. For other people, when there's less clarity, they say we should do whatever we want with this because there's less clarity. Probably the truth is somewhere in between, that we should be wise and discerning and pray for God's wisdom as we think about applying biblical principles to an area that's pretty complex in a dramatically changing culture just in the last few decades. So to really think about that and pray about that together. So these 3 lenses, the first lens I called an integrity lens. And the integrity lens typically begins with Scripture in the creation accounts, Genesis 1, Genesis 2, and it will talk about the essential maleness or essential femaleness of people at creation. And so there's something sacred about that. And so adopting a cross-gender identity seems to go against something that has an integrity to it or a sacredness to it. And it's often that adherents here tend to think about this in moral terms of right and wrong, and that this would be sin to engage in such and such a behavior. And so it has a little bit of a quality of willful disobedience, that someone is willfully disobedient in the area of gender identity. A second lens I called a lens of disability, and this would view this more as a variation that occurs in nature. So it's not really in the moral category of right and wrong. It's just that there are variations that over several hundreds of times, or however many percentages we would talk about, some people experience a lack of congruence between their biological sex and their gender identity. So not imbuing it with moral significance, but saying there's variations. Now, a Christian who's drawn to that lens would say, but why are there variations that occur in nature? And the Christian might draw more from Genesis 3 and say, well, because the creation is fallen. And so we would expect that the fall could touch our sexuality and our gender in ways that make this really complicated. And so this lens tends to draw a little bit more compassion and empathy, like any other disability or variation or something like that. You'd say, well, how do I support the person? How do we come alongside them as they're figuring out what to do around gender identity? Then the third lens is the lens I call diversity. And this is the lens that the culture around us has rapidly moved towards. My field is steeped in. And so there's this sense that when we talk about diverse gender identities, we are talking about essentially an emerging culture that we should be celebrating. And so much of the culture war around these topics tend to be around the integrity lens and the diversity lens, kind of locking horns around these issues. But I find the lenses to be just helpful, maybe to sort of locate, how you come at this, how you think about this. And in my own writing, I actually recommended we think about integrating the best of each of these lenses if we can. And so what that could look like is you would have the integrity of sex differences. I do think a biblically faithful starting point starts in the Genesis accounts, that there is a a biblically faithful place to begin with the integrity of sex differences. But we also want to recognize that the fall accounts for the world in which we live in now. And so there are going to be exceptions to the binary and exceptions to the norm. There's going to be other experiences, and we'll want to think about how to respond to those with empathy and compassion. And you say, well, Mark, what do you get out of the diversity lens? Aren't we at the church at war with the diversity lens? Well, I'm not sure that we're at war with the diversity lens. We're at war. We may disagree with some of the conclusions that are drawn there, some of the statements that are made there. But I do think the diversity lens is appealing to some people because it tries to answer questions about identity and questions about community. Who am I, and of what community am I a part? And oftentimes, people who are navigating these issues are welcomed into the broader LGBTQ community, the mainstream of that community, which is often referred to as the family. And often they don't get a sense of identity or community within the local church. And so even if I disagree with how those questions are answered in the diversity lens, I have to recognize that the diversity lens is trying to address those questions and often does so in a compelling way to the person navigating this terrain. So we want to at least recognize that piece and probably as a church think and pray about how do we address questions of identity? How do we address questions of community? Because they're going to be important to people who are navigating this space. Now, in my work, I have interviewed many people who are transgender, who are people of faith, and trying to figure out, as people of faith, how to live with their gender identity and the challenges that are connected to that. And I found it helpful to think of a person's life as a book with many chapters. And so we've come up with essentially 5 chapters that we've seen in the interviews that we've done. But there's this initial chapter of childhood where when gender identity develops, it tends to develop between ages 2 and 4. A boy or a girl is aware that they're a boy or a girl between that age range. And if someone struggles in their gender identity, it's kind of apparent at a pretty young age. Now, we see some exceptions to that today, but that's generally been the way it's been. And then they'll bump up against limit that is set on them, usually from a parent saying, that's not the way boys behave, that's not the way girls behave. And there'll be sort of this conflict in how they experience their gender identity and how the people around them are saying, is that okay? And then, because we were interviewing Christians, there's a chapter on their religious faith, all of them turning to their faith for answers and praying about this and looking for God for solutions about this. And in the cases that we saw, you do see cases where this resolves on its own. If a child has this, in most of the cases, it resolves. If you don't do anything, it just resolves as they go through puberty and later into adolescence. But if it doesn't resolve, it tends to be something that's more of an enduring reality for that person. And so as they turned to their faith was a resource to them, but it didn't resolve the gender dysphoria. It wasn't like if you prayed about it, it would go away. It would not happen anymore. They continued to struggle with it. And so there's a subsequent revisiting of their gender identity and then just learning to cope with it. One person I interviewed said, I dress a certain way to manage my dysphoria. Dressing as a tomboy helps, so biological female. I avoid situations where I would be expected to wear a dress, situations with heightened gender expectations, black tie events. I understand which situations push my button and I avoid them. Okay, so this person managing the dysphoria by being very thoughtful and intentional about clothing and how they present to other people. And this person also said later in the interview, they said to me, the secular answer for us is to transition everybody. The Christian answer is to just find healing in Christian ministry. But the person said the reality for the vast majority of us is that we just struggle with it every day and it's very, very painful. And I think that captures my experience too in counseling people around this topic. So let's talk about a more nuanced approach to ministry. How do we live with and care for and minister to someone who experiences their gender identity differently? What's that going to look like? So I want to talk about 3 levels of engagement. So I'm going to ask you first to locate your area of ministry. What has God called you to do in terms of ministry in this area? So there's 3 identities that I want to talk about. There's a political identity that's more of an activist. There's a public identity, which is more of your neighbor. And there's a private identity, which is someone who's asking for counsel in ministry. So first, with the political identity, this is the person who is more of an activist. I would say most of us are not called into that realm. It's just not part of the world that we live in. But for those of us where it is, we want to affirm the personhood of that person, still made in the image of God. We want to try to see things through their eyes, even where we disagree. Sometimes identify superordinate goals, which are goals that we might share, like how to be respectful of people and have civil dialogue about things and make sure that people are safe and not at risk of greater homelessness or suicidality or things like that. So superordinate goals. And we want to relate with convicted civility. This is Richard Mau's term. He was the former president at Fuller Theological Seminary. But you should have convictions and civility. That's what Christians should be characterized by. But you know that there are many Christians who are strong on conviction, but you wouldn't want them to represent you in the broader culture. They just don't seem to be very kind and gracious people. But then you have other Christians who are so strong on civility, you have no idea what they believe in. And so you need Christians with convicted civility as a way to balance that out. I would just add to that, maybe layer in some compassion. Convicted civility seasoned with compassion might be my goal. I remember when an activist came to my former university to protest me. I don't get that too often, to be honest with you, but they had put out a YouTube video saying, we're going to come to this campus and we're going to protest. I was just presenting data from a study I'd completed, and so they were going to protest me at my own campus. And so I was meeting with a friend of mine, and they're like, what do we do with that? So we decided we would call the person and just invite them. I mean, they were coming anyway, right? So I called them and I said, I'd like you to just, as you come to campus to be my guest, I'd like to meet with you. And so, they came. I was presenting. They probably took up the first 3 rows and kind of stared intently at us as I was presenting. And then afterwards, connected with that person, went out for coffee a couple times with that person. They actually reposted a video and said, it wasn't really what I thought it was going to be. He's a lot, I don't agree with everything that he said, but he was pretty thoughtful about what he was saying, and it was pretty, it was kind of a complicated area that he was talking about, and I thought he did a good job representing a lot of different things fairly. And, he was eviscerated by his own community for not capitalizing on the opportunity to take me down. But by being honest about his experience with a Christian, he was able to, I think, have a real interesting encounter with what do you do with people not meeting up to the caricature you have in your mind about them. Another activist, we went out for coffee a couple times, and he said, I thought based on the way people talked about you that you'd have smoke coming out of your nostrils and kind of horns coming out of your head, but you're like one of the nicest people I've met. And this person, he gave me permission to share this with you, but he was raised as a Christian. He was raised in the church. And he ended up revisiting the faith of his childhood, and he rededicated his life to Christ a few months later. Now, that doesn't happen with most people that I interact with at this level, but there's no chance of it ever happening if you don't relate to the person behind the activist, right? The second area, then, would be public identity. And this is, again, your neighbor. This is a coworker. This might be a family member, right? This is how do I relate to somebody who just wants to do life in a diverse, pluralistic culture. They're bagging my groceries. They're just dropping my pizza off, and they're just a person who's navigating gender identity differently than my experience, but how do I relate to that person? This is probably going to be an area of ministry for most of us. So this, to me, is about more like hospitality. What does it mean to meet people where they are and enter into a relationship with them by being genuine and warm and focused on the relationship as you would anybody who has an individual characteristic that you're not familiar with? But the church, we can do this. We've done this with other people from different religious backgrounds, different cultural backgrounds. And I know it feels like a stretch around gender identity because maybe how rapidly things have shifted in the culture. But this strikes me as something that the church could rise to this occasion. And we could do this on a one-to-one way with neighbors and coworkers and so on and so forth. And then the third area is that of private identity. And so this is somebody who is experiencing a conflict and they're asking for help. They're wanting help navigating this space, maybe in counseling or ministry. So I work in this area. You might be asked to come alongside someone who's in conflict around this. And so you want to create space that is emotionally safe for that person, spiritually safe for that person, where they can take their gender seriously, they can take their faith seriously, and they can take how they relate the two seriously. And that means, I think, for me, taking the long view, thinking of their life as a book with many chapters. And you don't know always how God's working in their life now and how he's worked with them in the past. And you want to position yourself to be an agent of ministry to them. I remember one pastor called me, and someone in their 40s or 50s had called them and said, I'm transgender. I was wondering if I could meet with you and just talk about what that could look like, if I'd even be welcome at your church. I just don't even know where to turn. So the pastor hung up with that person, and they called me and said, I didn't know what to say to the person. They didn't cover this in seminary. And I said, why don't you call them back and take them up on the offer to have coffee? And when you sit down with them, you say to them, I feel like I'm meeting you at about chapter 7 of your life, but I haven't had the chance to hear about chapters 1 through 6, and I'd like to. And I guarantee you that this person has not had an evangelical pastor invite them to share a little bit more about their story and the chapters that preceded this moment. And that doesn't mean you're committing to anything. That just means you're understanding and kind of thickening the plot about who this person is and kind of where you're going to go from there in ministry. When we did a study many years ago, it was the first study that I was aware of transgender Christians. We published this in a peer-reviewed article, and we asked the question, what kind of support would you have liked from the church? And the one answer has always stood out to me. The person said, someone to cry with me rather than just denounce me. Hey, it's scary to see God not rescue someone from cancer or schizophrenia or gender dysphoria, but learn to allow your compassion to overcome your fear and your repulsion. In another study, we also asked the person, what advice would you give to people in ministry in this space? And this person said, not to say God doesn't make mistakes. It's telling them you're a mistake. The biggest thing is accepting me and that sin entered the world and that things happen. It isn't any less real than kids born with Down syndrome or ADHD. Just by loving people and accepting people, and now I can figure out how to do this. Say, I love you. God loves you. I'll help you walk through this in a godly way. And that was the advice that this person gave in one of the interviews that we did. So when I think about your local faith community, let me say a couple things about this. I would encourage you to make a distinction between kind of macro level engagement and micro level engagement. So really quickly, macro level is more doctrine that you hold around sexuality and gender. The series that you're talking about now, biblical view of sexuality, biblical view of gender. It's some of the policies that you may have in place as a church, things like that. And those are at the macro level, and they tend to be a little bit more top down. This is what we believe. This is what we adhere to. This is how we understand these things. These are the norms that we hold. And you have to have those things kind of understood, like this is what we believe. This is the doctrine that we hold to around sexuality and gender. But at the macro level, it will come across as a little more power-based, a little more top-down to the person in the pew who's a guest figuring this out, or maybe in youth group or trying to understand gender identity. So you want to distinguish that from the micro level, which is the level of relationships. And the level of relationships, what's really valuable here is to demonstrate that you see people, that you hear people, that you believe people, that you're meeting them where they are. Because when that's rich and there's a thickness to that relationship, I see you, then people can understand and hear more about the macro level teachings that the church may hold. I remember one of the people I interviewed for one of our studies, I asked them, what's the most effective way for coping with gender dysphoria for you? And she said to me, do you really want to know? And I said, well, I'm doing an interview. Yes, I'd like to know. She said, it's not coping. It's not coping. The single most important, effective thing for me is that my family believes me. Because this person knows that for other families, other people navigating this, they don't even believe that this is real. And so they'll say to them, you're just making this up or whatever. This is just all in your head. And the person says, my family believes me. And that makes other coping strategies possible because the starting point is that they believe me. So at the micro level, I believe you. I see you. I hear you. Tell me more about that is a very powerful entryway for ministry. So how do you live with and care for and minister to someone who experiences gender identity differently than you? As I'm mentioning, I think the ministry posture is that of accompaniment. Come alongside them, walk with them. You're going to have an emphasis here on compassion. For gender dysphoria, it's a very painful experience. So suffering with, coming alongside them. I remember one couple that came to see me, the wife who had gender dysphoria. At the end of these consultations, they're going to go back to their faith community and their community at large. And we try to encourage them to speak to leaders within their faith community. And she said, we tried that. We went to someone, a leader in our faith community, and they said, pick up your cross and follow after Christ. And she said, I don't even know what that means for me. And she said, I don't even know that my pastor knows what that means. Like, she was feeling like what we can't do in Christian ministry is give people memes and sound bites and think that that exhausts our ministry obligations to people. We have to enter in and accompany and walk with them and live out picking up our own cross so that we have models of what that looks like and be more open about how are we dealing with suffering in our own lives and how is God meeting us in the painful places of our lives so that when someone is also feeling enduring pain like this, they can talk with us about that without it being just a meme that tries to answer that and move on to other obligations. And then seek to understand how God could be speaking in this person's life as it is now and the decisions that they may be facing moving forward. I would rather God be present in that person's life and work on discipleship of this person so that God and the Holy Spirit can be a resource to them as they're facing decisions in the months and years ahead. So they say that icebergs, like only 10% of an iceberg is what you see, that 90% of it is underneath the surface. What happens in this conversation is that gender atypicality is what you see when you're interacting with someone in this space. How they dress, how they keep their hair, maybe other mannerisms and voice inflection that is gender atypical. And I think sometimes we react to what's above the surface. That is not a very helpful way to approach ministry to people in this space. What I would encourage you to do is minister to what's beneath the surface. So what might be beneath the surface for someone navigating these issues? Well, it's going to be spiritual questions. Like, what does God think about me or people like me? Or why did God make me this way? Now, my own view is I don't know that it's clear that God made a person this way, but I don't think God is surprised in God's sovereignty that you're navigating questions around gender identity. And so we want to be able to encourage people to turn to God and turn to their faith. They'll have questions about identity. Who am I in light of these gender identity questions? Or questions about intimacy. How will my needs for intimacy be met? How will I be known by other people? And questions about community. Probably if this is, a teenager in the community who's invited to youth ministry, this is the number one question they would ask coming to youth ministry is, am I wanted here? And I do a lot of training for people in youth ministry as leaders of youth ministry. And I hope, my trainings that the resounding answer to that question is yes. There's no other place we'd want you to be on a Wednesday night or a Sunday night than here in our youth ministry. Is it going to become complicated? Yes. Is it going to be messy? Yes. But we'd rather you be here than any place else. So a resounding yes. Am I wanted here? Of course. This is where we'd like you to be. And let me just close with a quote from another friend of mine. This is a woman who experiences gender dysphoria too, but she presents as a woman. She is a biological female, presents as a woman. I have to clarify all this in these conversations. And she talks a bit about her gender dysphoria from a faith perspective. Here's what she says. She says, suffering in Christianity is not only not meaningless, it is ultimately one of the most powerful media for the transmission of meaning. We can stand in adoration between the cross and kneel and kiss the wood that bore the body of our Savior, because this is the means by which the ugly, meaningless, atheistic suffering of the world, the problem of evil, was transmuted into the living water, the blood of Christ, the wellspring of creation. The great paradox here is that the tree of death and suffering is the tree of life. And this central paradox in Christianity allows us to love our own brokenness precisely because it is through that brokenness that we image the broken body of our God and the highest expression of divine love. That God in some sense wills it to be so seems evident in Gethsemane. Christ prays, not my will but thine be done. And when God's will is done, it involves the scourge and the nails. It's also always struck me as particularly fitting and beautiful that when Christ is resurrected, his body is not returned to a state of perfection as the body of Adam in Eden, but rather it still bears the marks of his suffering and death. And indeed, that is precisely through these marks that he is known by Thomas. I suspect, this is something that this friend of mine reviewed, something I'd written on this topic, and this was one of the notes that she sent me as an email, and I said, could I just include this in the book? And it is, and it's so powerful as a person of faith navigating these questions and reminding us that there may be value in Christianity exploring suffering and exploring what that looks like. That's very counterintuitive for Christians today, to explore how could God meet me and be present to me in suffering, even enduring conditions and chronic conditions like that. And I would say that this friend of mine has a gender dysphoria that she's able to manage. So she wears clothing that's comfortable for her, like t-shirts and jeans and things like that, and is comfortable wearing the clothing that she's wearing. And she would be the first to say, don't use me as a poster child for how everybody should navigate this question. I'm able to do this, but there's other people whose gender dysphoria is much more severe and wouldn't be able to do what I'm doing, and they may need to consider other steps to manage their dysphoria differently. So I suspect a ministry approach in this area is going to need to be fairly nuanced and nimble and work with people on a case-by-case basis. And I hope that in some small way, this conversation this morning, this time together, may better equip all of us to minister to people in a way that's faithful to Scripture and honors the image of God in all people.